Thank you, Tony and Sherry. When I was in the 5th grade, my parents made a decision to leave the church that we had grown up, or I had grown up at, and spent my entire life at that point, and we changed churches. And shortly thereafter, once we got settled into this new church, I became fast friends with one of the preacher's sons. He had 3 boys. One of them was my age, and so we had our age and same grade in common. Beyond that, we had similar senses of humor. So I suppose because of that, we were both a scourge to the congregation. But anyway, his name was Jeremy. And Jeremy and I, among other things, were in the same Sunday school class. And at that point, we had a teacher whose name was Mr. Godwin. And Mr. Godwin was a great teacher. He was and still is a godly man. I've always thought a lot of him. And God has blessed him. He's blessed him with a great family. He's blessed him materially. He's a kind, gracious, godly man. I think a lot of him. But I don't remember exactly the first time it was, but this happened a number of times over a span of a couple of years. And that is that Mr. Godwin would come to me and Jeremy in particular, and then sometimes a few of the other guys in our class, and he would ask us about helping him with some yard work. And he was going to pay us for doing this, but it wasn't your typical yard work. It wasn't just mowing a lawn and trimming some hedges. It was much more involved and a lot more to it. And so, for example, one day, he had asked Jeremy and I and some others to help him. His house at that point was sitting on a lot that was probably 3 or 4 acres. And on the far edges of them, he had planted on either side about 50 long-needled pine trees. So 50 on this side, way on the other side of the property, another 50 trees. And so job one for us was to get a mower, lower it as far as you possibly can, and then skin all the grass around where all these trees are. The plan was to make these pine needle beds. And so once the grass was cut so low, he wanted us to rake all that dead grass out. And then he wanted to lay down a bed of dead leaves. And so we raked up the leaves that were in his yard, and we spread those as far as they could go. But we still needed more leaves. So we'd drive around southeast Charlotte going through neighborhoods and looking for people that had put out their bags of leaves for garbage collection. We'd pick up truckloads of those and go take them and dump them back out. Once we finally had the leaves down, then it was time to spread about 200 bales of pine needles. It takes a little while to spread 200 bales of pine needles. And so we did that. But once we were through with that, we still weren't done. Mr. Godwin wanted us to get some rakes and get the leaves and the gumballs off the top of the roof of his barn. And so we get up on ladders and we get the gumballs and the leaves off the roof of his barn. And even then, we still weren't done. There were a couple of dead trees that needed to be cut down and chopped up and hauled off, and so we did that. And so it was a long day, and by the time the day was over, we were just absolutely beat. But it was always something like this when Mr. Godwin would come to you and ask you about helping him with some yard work. So consequently, let's say it was a Wednesday night after RAs, Jeremy and I may be out with some others playing basketball once we were done, and we would see the doors to one of these entrances open, and Mr. Godwin would come walking out, and we could tell that he was headed in our direction. And you could just see in his eyes what it is that he was wanting. And Jeremy may, for example, notice, and then he would say, "Uh-oh, yard work." Because we didn't have the heart to tell him, no, we weren't really interested. We felt like we needed to do this. And, of course, beyond that, he was paying us, and so we didn't have the heart to say no anytime he asked us. And so we would see him come, and Jeremy would say, "Uh-oh, yard work." And so what would we do? Well, what happened over time is that we would see him headed our direction, so we would go a different direction. And all of a sudden, we would need to go back into the church and into a different exit, and so we would just run from him so that he couldn't ask us to do what he wanted us to do. Now, the truth is, spiritually, as those that profess to be followers of Christ, a lot of times we're doing something very similar, and that is that we are running from a God that wants us to do things. Now, one of the most understated statements in all the Bible is where God says, "My ways are not your ways, and my thoughts are not your thoughts." God does things differently than we do. He thinks about things differently than we do. Consequently, God has a different set of plans for us than oftentimes we have for ourselves. And we recognize that this God that made us and the Savior that died for us, He has expectations of us. There's things that He wants us to do, things that He wants us to accomplish, ways in which He wants us to live. But unfortunately, a lot of times the plans that He has and the expectations that He has for us, they're very different than those that we have for ourselves. And so what do? We do exactly what I did when I was little, and I would head in the opposite direction. Now, This is not something that's new. It goes back to the opening chapters of Genesis. You see, once sin came into the world, the first thing that Adam and Eve did was to run from God. And the greatest example we have of somebody running from God is the Old Testament prophet Jonah. And we're going to be beginning a series today through this little book that we're just entitling simply On the Run, When God's Plans Are Not Yours. And what we see throughout this little book is somebody that recognized as a follower of God, they had a different plan than God had for them, and so they decided, I'm just going to run. But how did his act of running begin? The same way that ours does. It starts with disobedience. And if you and I can understand the truth about how disobedience works, hopefully what can happen is that we cease this pursuit of running from God and begin to change where we start running to Him. So how exactly does this disobedience work in our lives? Look with me, if you will, in your Bibles today to Jonah chapter 1. Jonah chapter 1. If you have trouble finding that, it's right after Obadiah. Jonah chapter 1, and we'll start reading with verse 1. We're just going to look at the first 4 verses, and many of you are familiar with the story, but the words tell us, now that the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish, so he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord sent out a great wind on the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship was about to be broken up. Now we're going to stop there. In the coming weeks, we're going to go back to the story, and we'll pick up the parts of the story that you're most familiar with. But here in this passage, we see somebody that is absolutely on the run from God. And his running from God begins ultimately with disobedience. And how it worked in his life is exactly the same way that it works with us. So how exactly does it work? Well, first of all, because we know the right, disobedience is an option. Because we know what is, and because we know the right, disobedience is an option. Well, as this little book begins, it does little to set up the stage or to establish any context for us. The story just begins. And everything that we know about Jonah, you have just read. We know that Jonah, first of all, he's a prophet of God. We're told in verse 1 that he is the son of a man named Amittai. Beyond this, we know that he was originally from a little town called Gath, about 2 miles north of Nazareth. And beyond that, we know that his Hebrew name Jonah literally means dove. Now, verse 1 tells us that the word of the Lord came to Jonah. And he gives this command to get up and go to Nineveh. Now, before we deal with the command itself, we need to think about this whole idea of the word of the Lord came to him. Now, what exactly does that mean? In short, it means that somehow God communicated to him. Now, the text doesn't tell us exactly how God communicated to him. I mean, there are other examples in the Old Testament where God audibly speaks to an individual. Maybe God did that with Jonah, or maybe it was more like he speaks to us, where God just put this burden on his heart, and he showed him and somehow communicated to him in his spirit, this is exactly what I want you to do. And it seems that it was very clear to Jonah what it was that God wanted him to do. In fact, we're told explicitly the command was in verse 2 to arise and go to Nineveh, that great city. And so Jonah knew in his heart exactly what it was that God wanted him to do. There's no uncertainty. There's no, well, maybe it's Nineveh, maybe it's New York, maybe it's Nineveh, maybe it's Reidsville. I mean, there was no uncertainty in his mind. He knew exactly where God wanted him to go. Beyond that, he knew what God wanted him to do specifically, which was to preach to these people. He says, cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me. Now, a little bit about Nineveh itself. We're told in verse 2, and it's described as a great city. And that doesn't mean great as in a wonderful place to live. Rather, it was speaking of the size of this city. This was an enormous city on the banks of the Tigris River, opposite the modern-day city of Mosul in modern-day Iraq. There was this enormous city, and beyond the size of it that the text alludes to, we're told of their just unrelenting wickedness, that this was a wicked city. Now, the text doesn't tell us what all that wickedness was. We know from even secular archaeologists some of the wickedness that occurred. They had a king at one point whose name was Ashurbanipal. Isn't that a great name? Ashurbanipal. And he was known for cutting the lips off the faces of his enemies. They had another king whose name was Tiglath, and to his enemies, what he would have them done is flayed to death. And once they were dead, he would cut their heads off, and he would pile up mounds of the skulls of his enemies throughout the city. Beyond its brutality, though, it seems that there was an excessive amount of wickedness in the city. In short, all we can know is, and what we can know for certain, is that what they were doing collectively as a people was in direct violation of what God had established was right and wrong. So we can only assume that there was rampant sexual immorality. We can assume that there was a complete lack of justice and oppression of the poor. All of these things were going on. And God says that their wickedness has come up before me. I am aware of what's going on. And so he tells Jonah, listen, I want you to go to that city and I want you to announce, I want you to preach and announce the impending judgment that's going to happen to them because of their wickedness in my sight. Now, if you're familiar at all with the story of Jonah, you know that he does not initially go to Nineveh. In fact, he is getting ready to head the opposite direction. Where Jonah was at was about 550 miles away. And there's no trains, there's no planes, there's no automobiles, there's nothing like that. And so for a man to walk even 15 or 20 miles a day, it was going to take him more than a month to go and head to the city of Nineveh. Does he go there? No. He gets on a boat and is going to head the opposite direction. All right, so God has said, I want you to go to Nineveh. He's been very clear about that. Beyond that, God has been clear about what he's to do when he gets there, to preach and announce the impending judgment that's going to happen to them because of their wickedness. So he knows where to go, he knows what to do. And what does Jonah do? The exact opposite. Notice how verse 3 begins. But Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish. What I'm trying to make very clear is that it was made very clear to Jonah exactly what he was to do. God had announced to him what was right. But because God had revealed to him and made clear to him what was right, disobedience for Jonah all of a sudden became an option. You understand that God has decided, because he's God, when he made us, he was going to make us and did make us as volitional creatures, which is to say that we have a will. We have the capacity to choose this or that or the other. God's made us that way. But not only has God made us that way, it is also clear that God has given to us innumerable expectations and things that he wants us to do. I mean, the first place that we can start is with the Bible itself. And in both Old and New Testaments, there's a lot of stuff that God has said for every single one of us. I want you to do this. I want you to do that. I don't want you to do this. I don't want you to do that. God has given us some very clear instructions and some very clear expectations and has revealed to us what is right. Beyond what he's given to us and the truth he's provided to us on the pages of the Bible, it's also clear that God grants to us as his followers this opportunity where he speaks to us. Now, I don't mean that he speaks in an audible way, but he communicates to us in our heart, and he puts burdens on our hearts. I want you to do this. I want you to speak to this person, and I want you to say this. I want you to stop this. I want you out of this relationship. I want you to pursue this relationship. There are so many times, if we're paying attention, where beyond the pages of the Bible, God speaks to us. And as he speaks to us, he shows us what it is that he wants us to do. And in doing so, he is establishing for us what is right. So what I'm trying to say to you is that every single one of us as followers of God, God has made clear to us what is right. And because we know the right, all of a sudden for us disobedience becomes an option. It becomes a constant temptation for us in view of the fact that he's made his instructions clear. We know what he wants for us to do. So then we have the option, do I do that or do I do what I want? Well, it's obviously January now. It's cold outside, but as the weeks and months begin to unfold, it's going to start getting warmer, and by the time we get to June, July, and August, it's going to be hot. As you get into August proper, though, that's, I guess, technically when the hurricane season begins. And it really picks up in September, and you have these storms that form off the coast of Africa, become these tropical depressions, they become these hurricanes, and as they're making their way and churning across the Atlantic, forecasters begin to make projections as to where these storms are going to go. And the closer they get to the continental United States, the more accurate they get as to where these storms are going to make landfall. And odds are, at some point during this upcoming hurricane season, there's going to be some storm that's going to approach the United States, whether on the Gulf Coast or on the Atlantic coast. And as these storms inch closer to the continental United States, forecasters can then get very accurate as to where they believe these storms are going to make landfall, whether it's on the Gulf Coast or it's going to hit in Florida or it's going to hit on the coast of North or South Carolina. And so they get very accurate with these projections as to where these storms are going to make landfall. Consequently, state and local governments begin to do something. They try to get their people prepared. And so people are encouraged to board up windows, but most importantly, people are encouraged, especially along the coastline, to do what? Get out of Dodge. Get out of here. Head to higher ground. There's going to be a storm coming, we anticipate, with 130-mile-an-hour sustained winds. There's going to be a 12-foot storm surge. There's going to be threats of tornadoes. It's just going to be awful. Almost certain flooding is going to take place. Get out of town. And so the police will go by on their loudspeakers throughout neighborhoods announcing that the governor has declared a mandatory evacuation. Get out of town. The mayor has said, get out of town. There's this mandatory evacuation that's underway. All right, so they issue these evacuation orders, and they're telling people, this is what you got to do. Get out of town, and they're saying, you got to get out of town because we can't ensure your safety. And if you decide you're going to stay, well, it's up to you. We can't promise you that we'll be able to take care of you. So they issue these mandatory evacuation orders. Now, once that happens, though, invariably a local news crew is going to find some goon, an idiot somewhere. And you've seen them. Some guy named Gomer, and they're going to have him on there, and he's got about 1.5 teeth, and they're going to interview him, and they're going to find out, and this guy's going to say, I'm not going anywhere. And he's going to say, well, I've been here for 60 years, and I was here when Hazel hit, and if I can survive Hazel, I can survive this. I'm not going anywhere. And I'm thinking, what's the matter with you? I mean, who wants to sit in their house when 130-mile-an-hour winds are blowing outside, when there's this enormous storm surge and the ocean could literally wipe away the house? Have they not seen how many people have died because of this? Now, though there is this mandatory evacuation, the truth is it's not really mandatory. The police aren't going to physically take you out. They're not going to remove you from your home and ship you inland. They're telling you, get out. You have the command, but it's ultimately an option, are you going to do this? What I want to be clear about is that God gives to us the commands, and He's very clear about it. But He's not going to drag you by the nape of your neck. He's not going to grab you around the hair and drag you towards obedience. What God is going to do is to give you the expectation. He's going to show to you what is right, but because you know what is right, all of a sudden, for me, for you, disobedience becomes an option. And we're going to decide, we're going to make a choice, am I going to do things my way or am I going to do things God's way? Jonah had it very clearly presented to him. This is what I want you to do. Go to this city. This is the rationale. I want you to proclaim this message. Disobedience became an option for him. It was true for him, it's true for us. But beyond that, because we have a will, disobedience is a choice. Disobedience is a choice. All right, so God has clearly communicated to Jonah exactly what it is that he is to do. He's got to get up, he's to head north and east towards Nineveh. And so what does he do? He heads the opposite direction towards Joppa so that he can get on a boat to head to Tarshish, which is in modern-day Spain. All right, so you think Spain is over here on the opposite side of the Mediterranean. Iraq is over here. He's supposed to go this way, and Jonah heads this way. Well, how did he get heading that way? Well, because of a choice that he made. He did not accidentally wind up on a boat that just happened to be headed in the opposite direction. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate, intentional choice by Jonah. He wanted to get away from what God wanted him to do. In fact, we're told in verse 3, twice it talks about he sought to escape the presence of God. Jonah's thought was, if I can just get out of this area, then I can escape God's presence and I can escape what he wants me to do. So God has been clear about where he's to go, what he's to do, and Jonah decides, I'm going to do exactly the opposite. In truth, Jonah's disobedience, though, took place well before he ever stepped foot on the boat. It began at the moment of decision where he weighed, this is what God wants me to do, and this is what I want to do. And he decided, I'm going to do what I want to do. In the same manner, you don't necessarily have to physically go anywhere. You don't have to leave Greensboro. You don't have to flee the state to be able to disobey or run from God. When you make the decision, I'm not going to do things His way, you have made the choice, you have made the act, or you have made the decision that is going to lead you to act in ways that are completely opposite from what He desired you to do. You see, disobeying God is not so much an act or lack of action. Disobedience is ultimately a choice that we make in our hearts. Jonah fled physically because he had first fled in his heart at the point of decision. God had said, do this, and Jonah decided in his heart, I don't want to do that. And so before he ever took the first step, before he ever got on the boat, Jonah had already made the decision, the choice in his heart. What I'm trying to be clear about is this. Jonah did not accidentally wind up on a boat. He didn't wind up accidentally disobeying God. It was an expression of his will. It was an expression of his choice. And I want you to understand that when you disobey God, it won't be because of an accident. You just kind of stumbled into it. It won't be because the devil made you do it, as Flip Wilson used to say. It won't be for any of these reasons. It'll be exactly the same reason as it was for Jonah, because you decided in your heart, I know what's right, I know what God has said for me to do, and I'm still not going to do it. I'm going to do what I want to do. Now, at the outset of this message, I was talking about how when I was in 5th grade, our family changed churches. Up until that point, we had gone to the same church as my grandparents did. And from birth through the 5th grade, that's the only thing that I'd ever known. And so I was reluctant when we left, but it became a wonderfully beneficial decision, because for the first time when we changed churches, there were actually kids my age. And there were things that were going on that ministered to our entire family, and it was wonderful. And so my grandparents, though, remained at this church. And then after my grandfather died, my grandmother, that I called Charles, came to live with us. And so there would be times where at our new church, they weren't having services on a Sunday night. Let's say it was homecoming or whatever it was. We had homecoming, no services that night. And so my grandmother, Charles, would say, well, why don't you go to church with me? Okay, so I'd get in the car, and it was a car roughly about the length of this sanctuary. And you'd see about this much of her head sticking up above the steering wheel. And so we would get in the Battlestar Galactica, and we would head to her church. And so we would get there, and I absolutely hated it. I mean, there might have been 15 or 20, nothing but seniors. And just imagine, those of you who remember record players, if the song should be played at a 78, they were playing it at a 33. All right? So everything was just drug, and it was so dead, it was so lifeless, it was so boring, and I absolutely hated it. So she would ask me to go with her to church, and so I would feel obligated to go, and repeatedly I did this over the years. But as I got older, I began to think, I really don't want to go. And so she would ask me, hey, you want to go with me to church tonight? And I'd say, no, I don't want to go. And so Charles would, at that point, she would begin to pout, and she'd get mad, and she would say this, and I can't tell you how many times over the years I heard her say this: well, you're going to do what you want to do. I don't know if some of your parents or grandparents say, you're going to do what you want to do. It's not very profound, but that's exactly the truth, isn't it? You and I are only going to do what we want to do. Jonah didn't wind up on a boat headed in a direction running from God by accident. It was because he wanted to run from God. It's because he wanted to do things his way. God had been very clear and had given him, this is what I want you to do. But Jonah decided, no, I'm not going to do that. I want to do what I want to. Maybe you're here today, and if the truth is told, though you may be here in church and you're regularly here at church on a Sunday or even on a Wednesday night, your relationship with God could best be described as a portrait painted by Jonah's life. You're not running to him, you're running from him. Because throughout the weeks, throughout the months, what do? Well, you do what you want to. God has been very clear, and He's given you what He wants you to do, but you decided, because I've got the option, I'm not going to do that. And you wind up running not to Him, but from Him, because you decided in my heart, I want to do things my way. Well, there's a final truth, though, that's pretty clear from this passage, which is this. Because the Lord is God, disobedience is a challenge. Because the Lord is God, disobedience is a challenge. You and I not following the instructions and the command of God is not merely a difference in opinion. It's not where God kind of sits down with us and says, okay, here's what I think, now tell me what you think, and whichever way we go with this, it just doesn't matter. That's not at all how it works. God says, this is what I want you to do, this is what I'm commanding you to do, and it's not a difference of opinion if you decide not to do that. I mean, it's an act of absolute defiance. It's an act of disobedience. You're saying, I'm going to do things my way. And when we disobey God, we are ultimately saying to Him by our actions, God, you must not know everything, because if you knew everything, you'd know what I want to do is really right. If you really knew everything, then you'd know that what I want to do is really best. Well, when we disobey God beyond that, we're saying by our actions, God, your plans really, they are inferior to mine. If what you wanted was truly best, well, I'd obviously be doing that. I'm going to do what's best. And so your plans clearly are inferior to mine, because if they were better, well, I'd absolutely be doing that. And so when you and I have God tell us to do something, whether on the pages of His Word or on the pages of our heart, when we decide we're not going to do that, we are looking to God and we are saying this, my way is better. I know better than you. Now, in doing so, recognize what it is that we are actually doing. We are challenging the very nature of God and who He is. We're saying you don't know better, your ways aren't best, your plans aren't superior, mine are, and that's why I'm going to follow them. And in doing so, we are absolutely challenging the authority of God. Now, when we challenge the authority of God, when we challenge Him in this way, understand that God is going to respond. In verse 2, again, you have the instructions of God to Jonah. He says, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, cry out against it. Their wickedness has come up before me. Notice how verse 3 begins with the conjunction, but. But Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish. So God has said, this is the right, but Jonah decided the other way was better. He heads in the opposite direction. It's as if Jonah is thinking, I'm not going to be outdone by God. And so he heads the opposite direction. But notice how verse 4 begins. Keep in mind, we're just told, but Jonah headed the opposite direction. I'm not going to be outdone by God. Notice how verse 4 begins. But the Lord. When you and I disobey God, we are through our actions saying, my ways are better, my plans are better, my insight is superior. We're saying all of these things, and that is taken by God as an absolute challenge to who He is, to His understanding, to His wisdom, to His plans, to His power, to His authority, to all of those things. And when that happens, God is going to respond every single time. It happened for Jonah, and it's going to happen for me. It's going to happen for you. Because God doesn't view our disobedience as a difference in opinion. He views it as a challenge to who He is. Now, we have 4 children, and I absolutely love them from the depths of my heart. And God has blessed us with these 4 kids, and it's amazing how different they are. They are wonderfully different. They have completely different personalities, different temperaments, different everything. And though there are all these differences, there's one thing that is true of each of them, and individually and collectively, which is this. They're still children, and because of that, they're going to do some things, say some things, or respond in some ways that are unacceptable. Take, for example, something that happened just less than 2 weeks ago at our house. This particular thing happened with Nathan, and Nathan really is, he is a wonderfully good little boy. And Nathan loves rules, loves abiding by rules, but sometimes he still has problems with that. He just turned 7 years old, and he still has some problems with this. This particular day, I was seated in the den, and I was watching TV, barely paying attention to what was going on. But Caroline steps into the den, and she tells Nathan to pick up some toys that are in there, put them in some baskets that are over on the shelf. So she's been very clear. Nathan, this is what I want you to do. Put these toys up, put them in those baskets. And again, I'm barely paying attention, but I do overhear what's going on. Caroline tells him this, and Nathan does what? He says, no. Dun, dun, dun. All right, a very clear, explicit command. He says, no. Now, again, I was barely paying attention to this, but I hear words like no. And I immediately recoiled and I said, Nathan, what did you say? Nothing. And he goes to pick some toys up and he puts them in the basket. Now, as far as he was concerned, that was the end of the story, but Nathan got a spanking that day. And the reason that he got a spanking that day is not because it really made a difference one way or the other, whether a toy is in the basket or it's on the floor. That's not that big of a deal. But what is a big deal is when he, as a little boy, decides which of the commands that his parents gives him that he's going to listen to or not. Because he's not in charge, we are. And when he decides he is going to challenge that authority, we're going to respond every single time. Listen, God is going to, and He does continually, through the pages of His Word and on the pages of your heart, tell you specific things that He wants you to do. Sometimes it's something that He wants all of us to do, which is to live holy lives before Him. He wants us to guard our thought life and to watch what it is that we say. He wants us to forgive people even if they're very difficult to forgive. He's given us all those commands. But beyond that, there's some specific things that He's placed in our heart that He may want us to, like in Jonah's example, to go somewhere and share a message that He wants us to share. Maybe for you, that's somebody that you work with in the break room at lunch, or it's somebody that's in the cafeteria with you at school. But God puts this burden on your heart. Do this. And when you decide in your heart, I'm not going to do this, do you know what God views that as? As a challenge to who He is. And I want you to understand this. He will respond to that challenge every single time. Disobedience, because we know the right, is an option. Disobedience, because we have a will, is a choice. It doesn't happen by accident. But because the Lord is God, disobedience is a challenge. All right, so you've heard all this, and the simple question in response to it is this: so what? So what? What does this have to do with me, and what does this have to do with where I am right now? The simple truth is that there are probably multiplied people here in this room today, though you're here at church and you're here every week. Though you may know the songs, or even if you don't, you may stand up and try to follow along as best you can. Though you may not teach the Sunday school class, you show up and you try to participate in the discussion. You bow your head at the right time, you stand up, you sit down. You're doing everything from an outsider's perspective right. But the truth is, when you leave here, you know that there are things, in fact, right now, you know that there are things that God wants you to be doing that you're not. There's things that He's been very clear to you that He doesn't want you to do, that you are deciding that you want to do. And your life and your relationship with God right now is best described as being on the run from Him. So what? The question is, are you content for it to be that way? Do you want to stay on the run? Because when you're on the run, God is going to respond to what He views as a challenge. When you're on the run, there's blessings that you're going to miss out on. If you're on the run today, very simply, do you want to leave this place still with your jogging shoes on? Or are you ready to, for the first time in a long time, start running back to Him? Won't you bow your heads with me?